and welcome to the Theosophical Society, October 24th. A little bit early, but we're going to talk about the predictions and spiritual insights into 2020, and even the coming November 11th, Mercury transit, where Mercury crosses the face of the sun. I think this happens about, I forget if I'm remembering correctly, 13 times every 100 years or something. I thought we'd start off with a quote by Blavatsky, since we're at the Theosophical Society. Some old book I found that's survived the Mayflower that I wrote it a long time ago. It is the secret of the heart that we are so committed. S-O-U-L. It's the secret of the heart that we are so committed. When I was younger and smarter, I wrote this stuff, So October 24th, Blavatsky quote from H.P. Blavatsky quotation book, from her booklet called 5 Messages. The life of altruism, 24th. Help nature and work on with her, and nature will regard thee as one of her creators and make obeisance. From the voice of the silence. And from Isis Unveiled, Blavatsky, arcane knowledge misapplied is sorcery. Beneficently used, true magic is wisdom. Chogyam Trungpa says that the beginning of all magic is an open emptiness, right view of suchness, the right view of the wisdom of emptiness. And a quote from another guy who used to be a theosophist for a while, Rudolf Steiner. The happiness of the individual is inseparably connected with the happiness of all. The happiness of the individual is inseparable from the happiness of all. And from Rilke, the great poet, in his letter to his Polish translator, 1925, I think Rilke died pretty close to when Steiner died, within a year, I think. They're probably working together. Smart people like poets. It helps them get out of their head. Otherwise, you have to have a very good lover. Oh, that wasn't on tape, was it? Okay. From Rilke. It is our task to imprint this temporary, perishable earth into ourselves so deeply, so painfully, and passionately that its essence can rise again invisibly inside us. It is our task and work to imprint this temporary, perishable earth into ourselves so deeply, so painfully and passionately, that its essence can rise again invisibly inside us. We are the bees of the invisible. We wildly collect the honey of the visible to store it in the great golden hive of the invisible. We are the bees of the invisible. We wildly collect the honey of the visible to store it in the great golden hive of the invisible. And that pretty much says it all. So the first thing I want to talk about is what everybody's talking about as astrologers, is that we are heading toward a Saturn conjunct Pluto in January of 2020. And this happens every 33, 34 years to 38, 39 years. And midlife crisis in a way for a lot of people these days. And Pluto, in my book Astrological Aspects, Interpret and Explain, which badly needed an editor. But yet there's a lot of wonderful thinking in there. If you can dig it out, you have to dig out the gold. I helped a lot. The nuggets are easy to get out. But I relate Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto to the 3 steps of initiation and the redemption of light and magnetism and warmth. The redemption through Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, as phrased and perhaps praised by the 3 principles of the path of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the determination to be free, Uranus, and Neptune, the Bodhi mind, developing compassion for all who live, that relationship to awe that Steiner talked about. There's a part of us that's related to everything. And there's a part of us that has radical selflessness, whether we like it or not. To a degree we experience radical selflessness, we're not intimidated by the cruelties of this outer world, that unless you awaken the wealth within, the self-worth diminishes to a degree that you think you need a net worth. But if you're rich within, with wisdom, participation, love, I mean, love is great. Love would be a painkiller. If you love everybody, even if you're not real smart about it, I'm not always, it protects you a little bit. Protects you. Not forever, but for a while. You can have selflessness so that you get yourself out of the way, so you can start to just see for yourself. You can figure stuff out. And with a little bit of training and these books and these great wisdom masters, and so many people like my friend Doug here and many others that I know, like myself, who have just studied their whole life, looking at every book, would be dying, going, is that a new book? Did he write another book? You know, tell me the poem again. Like that, you know, we'll be alive, because we're alive somehow. We have to be alive with our inquiry in our enthusiasm to learn. So the Saturn-Pluto is a deadening effect. Saturn represents the limits of growth, and it represents on a negative side that there's too much trouble. We need a cop, we need authority, we need a lawyer, we need a judge, we need karma to come down like lightning from Zeus. People take the law in their own hands. So Saturn, on a negative level, is control freaking. And Pluto is that I'm dead anyway, so I don't mind if you die. You know, so the negative side of Pluto being discovered around the Great Depression, for instance, right in 1929, the Great Depression, whereas Neptune's discovered during was discovered during the time of magnetism discovery and Uranus electricity discovery. So some people think that Uranus, Neptune, Pluto are the fallen elements of electricity and magnetism. And what I'm referring to in the sense of Pluto, warmth and a selfless love for truth and a compassion for all the world. Pluto is so bad of an aspect, when it makes bad aspects. Pluto is so bad that that most people think they die, they feel like they wish they were dead, or that they go through excruciating times where they were attached to form. I was meditating today, and I had just for a second, and I had an insight into how death frees us from life and form, but enlightenment frees us within life and form. See, that's the thing, if I talk fast, that's why if I talk fast, you won't get it. You could get it, maybe. I got it when I was 21, but then you'd forget like 2 minutes later. Today, this woman from the television station was telling me these brilliant things that I used to say.
Did she remember?
Do you remember exact things that altered her life? And I go, wow, I think I did say that. She goes, oh, you did. I was right there. So Saturn and Pluto The good side of Saturn is spiritual discipline, asceticism, celibacy, quitting drinking, quitting whatever negative habit. There's a lot of people, for some reason, without knowing astrology, have been sacrificing their negative habit. Now, again, there's an approach to astrology that's historical, which I'll touch on. But there's another approach that are the virtues and non-virtues of the planets. All the planets, like in The Voice of the Silence by Blavatsky and the How to Know the Higher Worlds, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds by Rudolf Steiner, they talk about these virtues, 7 virtues, 6 or 7 virtues. Sometimes there's 6, and the 7th is this emptiness, the virtue of selfless learning. But the virtues are the ladder to heaven that connect heaven and earth. And so the planets become like these lords of karma and timekeepers and portals of time. But the planets are also virtues and non-virtues, and out of freedom and our ability of intelligence and wisdom and love, we can become friends with all the planets and activate their higher octave to shine or awaken from the lower moments in our life. I want to point out that Saturn and Pluto, depending on the retrograde motion, is a 33, 34 year cycle to 38 about. And a lot of people at that point, it's, Jesus is crucified at 33. They debate Buddha got enlightenment at 32, 33. There's a lot of 33 degrees in Masonry. This number shows up a lot in initiation stories and fables. Dane Rudger, the father of modern day astrology using Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and behind the scenes inspirer of people like Robert Hand and almost all the great astrologers of the royal. He thought that 35 was a really critical moment. This is like the midpoint. 35 is a really critical moment where you're not going to grow anymore. You've reached 30, 33, and you come to the realization after a couple years away from the Saturn return of 30, 33, you come to the realization that you're no longer influenced by unconscious, instinctive childhood behavioral patterns and conditionings or even previous life. And that one stops looking at the door they came in at and starts to look at where are we going. I mean, this is a sign of maturity at some point, keeping the best of the golden wisdom we got from the past, but looking where we're going and how does this serve the present. So the higher octave of Pluto is gardening, having a baby, birthing a new project, birthing. You can birth out of your legs, you can birth out of your heart, you can birth out of your head. One of my favorite friends, Athena, was born out of the Zeus's head. I was just talking to her the other day. I'm not ready to go with her yet. She keeps trying to talk me into becoming a warrior with her. But she's a good friend to have. And you can also birth out of your soul and your spirit, and you can help be a midwife to other people birthing out of their thinking and their day-to-day. So Saturn-Pluto also indicates an aging population and a midlife crisis and a war between the past and future, and the past and future needs being presented as task, work, karma. Saturn-Pluto, for sure, what most astrologers talk about, is, at least the way that I would put it in words, is its extremes in the weather. I was expecting a severely cold. Now again, astrology works very strangely. There's a higher and lower octave, and the same aspect could reverse and go the opposite way. I'm predicting a really harsh, cold winter and extremes in the weather around the world where there'll be drought and fire in one place and too much rain and water in another place and freezing cold in another place, which we're getting a lot of. I can't tell you where I read it, but I'm sure that I'm convinced I remember that Rudolf Steiner predicted that in the future we would have extremes in the weather, that it wasn't just getting hotter and it wasn't just getting colder. It was a pendulum swing, which my first spiritual teacher, Philip Knight, would also say, that we're going to extremes. Steiner pointed out that we're losing the middle. And in the old days when I'd hang out with Hans Gabert and other people like that, we would talk about the middle is the heart. We're going to extremes. We're all head, or we're all will-centered, sex-centered, will-centered, unconscious doing things, all the time busy, whether we're busy in our head or busy in our actions. But we flip from the upper third to the lower third. The lower third includes food. That people are just obsessed with food. I mean, even Rudolf Steiner, when he gave the agriculture talks, the birth of the new agriculture, reports this, that at one point he just like rashly just said, does it always have to be about drink and eating? You know, and smoking or whatever. I mean, he really was hard on the eating, drinking. Everybody couldn't wait to get done with the lecture and go eat and drink. So, I've been at fault for this myself, but I had to see what they were doing. No, it's a bad joke. That wasn't on the tape. Okay. So, that was a joke. So, but we all get caught up in it. You know, we have to find out, we're here to find out what life's about without getting killed by what we find out. For those Robert quotes, I guess. So the Saturn-Pluto is extremes in the weather and behavior, the emotional weather. And it's the fear of controls and the need of control. So when Saturn-Pluto comes, people do really irrational things and kill a bunch of people and shoot up a place or kill their family. Like you're seeing right now as we approach this in the last couple of years, it's worse than ever. And there's chaos. And there's secret manipulations behind the scenes. And there's a bunch of passion and feeling, but there's a lack of humility and truth that lasts, that frees people. Real truth frees people. Real truth has a freeing effect on where you're hung up. At the same time, simultaneous to feeling free, because you hear truth and you're free of something that restricted you. Yourself feels like you are yourself. But also you feel deeply, solemnly still. You're stilled. You're for lack of better words, your negative side is silenced. When you hear truth, you cannot be still enough to try to grasp it and hold it. It takes a long time to build a chalice or a cup or something that can gently hold truth so it doesn't just slip through the holes in our aura. And when we love, we're moved to great deeds. I mean, you can see like the people that love Trump or love Marianne Williamson or love whoever. I don't know if they love Biden and Mrs. Clinton, but there's a lot of money there, and that's a different kind of love. Puppy love. I'm making jokes again. This is really on tape. But we have to be free. What we're lacking is the freedom to share our ideas. Most of us lack ideas. We have opinions. Manly Haw goes out of his way to criticize people with too many opinions. But we lack a consensus that came about through good debate. And we press a button that we like or dislike, but we don't really have an honest debate. And the people that are loudest are often the most hurt. So this Saturn-Pluto is associated with a lot of very strange things throughout history that at this point I'm not going to make a big deal of, but it has to do, like Saturn-Pluto conjunct, David Rockefeller has Saturn-Pluto conjunct. So people that have strong Saturn-Pluto aspects can become filthy rich. Pluto rules the underworld, and that's where all the money is. The gnomes, the gold. That's where the power is. Materialistic power. Spiritual power is found through Pluto's incredible selflessness. So when you see people like St. Francis or Mother Teresa, I mean, you often see really strong Saturn or Pluto aspects that they've made into like incredible tolerance for suffering and the ability to work through it. because Saturn Pluto is a tremendous amount of workload. A lot of people I know, like myself and my fellow friend here, and many other people I know right now, are really hard at work. Sometimes that work is something that we wish we had. Sometimes it looks very pleasurable work, but nonetheless, that Saturn Pluto is like a tremendous amount of work and focus and rooting. Like the good side of Saturn Pluto is tearing out the old foundation and laying a new foundation, and behind the scenes and secret, esoteric, and rootedness. The negative side is esoteric power plays behind the scenes. The positive side is humility that can invoke the gods, which according to Neoplatonism would be the virtues, that we can invoke the virtues. So David Rockefeller, very wealthy. Another guy who has Saturn, Pluto, strong aspects. Snowden, the NSA guy who leaked all the stuff. See, who's tremendously selfless. I'm sure if we had time, we could look up the other guy that just is might be forced out of England to come here.
Assange.
Pardon me?
Assange.
Yeah, Assange. I mean, these are the kind of guys that, whether we like them or not, or whether they're good or bad, that they tried to flip it from the power to some kind of inner power, whether we agree or not. That also externalized into outer world things. So maybe they're just as materialistic, but they're doing it a little different way. Alex Jones, the InfoWar guy, Saturn-Pluto aspects. Saturn-Pluto conjunct, I believe. Bill Gates, Saturn-Pluto square. Conjunction, square, and opposing, according to my book, Astrological Aspects, the Art, the conjunction, square, and opposing is the most of especially the outer planets with the inner planets. So Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, on the sun, moon, ascending sign, can make you or break you, for good or bad. When you have like Saturn, Pluto, which are pretty much outer planets, that's Saturn and Jupiter. They're between socializing individual planets and collective planets. So when we say somebody has a Saturn, Pluto, everybody within a year or two of that birth is going to have that. You get it? A lot of people are going to have it. They're not all Bill Gates. So that's because somehow he was able, through the rest of his planetary aspects, to channel collective forces. You get it? I have Saturn and Pluto within 7 degrees. So my age, I think if you really give it a 10-degree arc, both ways, you're looking at a longer period of time, where a lot of people have that aspect. You see, I have Jupiter entwined to the Saturn Pluto, so I have a guardian angel helping me through the thickness of the material world. I've known a lot of people that are very successful in the material world. So it's like Saudi Arabia in their oil. They have a Saturn opposition Pluto. Everybody's fighting for their oil. To a degree they can hang on to it and handle the opposition, that if somebody's opposing them for what they want, they end up rich. To a degree they can't handle it, they end up a lot of people that live there are very poor. They don't get, Robert Murdoch has a Pluto opposing Saturn. Either you're a multimillionaire, most people are broke. I know another guy who's a billionaire, who's gone now, and he had the Pluto aspects when he tripled his money. He handled it. Most people go broke. So the Saturn Pluto is associated with power and who controls global resources and greed or feed or conduits to directing anything that's worth power or money over or through the masses. Saturn Pluto kind of rule over perpetual wars and midlife crisis. The sense of being crucified, and either you ascend or descend to hell. And Jesus wanted to make sure he covered everybody, so he did both. When you're really free, see, the thing is that when you're really free and you're initiated, like Rudolf Steiner points out that enlightenment is a soul process, but initiation into the spirit initiation is of the spirit. It's a process of the spirit when you're working with universal spirit. So taking taking responsibility for the parts of oneself that are unconscious or acting out of separateness or feel separated. That's where all the trouble comes, when we feel separated from our toys and our pleasures and our comforts, when we feel separated from what makes us feel secure, whether it's false or real. I think that most people in the old philosophy and schools of India and Tibet and Greece was that all this suffering comes out of the sin of the separation of the moon from the earth, meaning the separation from the oneness, a creative co-creativeness with the oneness. So Saturn Pluto is associated with perpetual war and midlife crisis, and taking this responsibility for one's own karmic crucifixion and resurrection or ascension. And other notables are the Saturn Pluto in India and Pakistan's chart, 1947, and around when Gandhi died. And India and Pakistan, after the war, were divided even more. And they're right now, when you look at certain countries that have Saturn-Pluto aspects natally, India and Pakistan, and many other countries, they're politically hot. Pluto, Neptune, Uranus can make a lot of transformation and change in a short period of time. Hong Kong, everything that's going on there with their fighting for freedom from China. Very difficult problem that is understood much better if you look at the Uranus right now transiting, squaring their sun. And when down the road, I have a note here somewhere, down the road, they have, when it comes to December and November, when it comes to November, December, Hong Kong has a Saturn-Pluto thing going on it, if I remember correctly. And to give you a little brief on it, the 33 to 38 year cycle of Saturn-Pluto, a shift to older, shift to more mature, or just feeling older and crystallized, or crucified, a crucifixion complex. How many people do we know are completely convinced that they're being crucified and there's these evil people that hate them? Everybody. So to think that you're special is ridiculous. Everybody I know is like thinking that. I do too, but I have a more spiritual Buddhic response, of course. And and I too think that there are people that are just so weird and mean. And I think we all do. Except that what happens is you just you have to learn a thinking that can see through it or transcend it and realize that this is not you. These aren't your higher angels. And that if your higher angels are going to fight for solutions to your own bad karma and non-virtue and your own contributing to it and your own ability to be still in the face of... I had an aspect for getting angry. And I read this beautiful thing about not getting angry and what you had to do and how to stay selfless and everything. And then within an hour, I got angry at somebody, And I had to, I cut it short and I left, but I was still angry. I had to deal with this anger in my body. So, the Saturn-Pluto is associated with this crucifixion complex, but also long-term illnesses or chronic conditions that don't resolve easily. Uranus will be bang, you got this, bang, it's gone. Even if it lasts for months or a couple years, it just goes quick. And Saturn-Pluto has this kind of chronic long-term thing to it, and problems taking lots of time to heal or reconfigure or reconstitute or fix. It's also connected with electromagnetic entombing of the Earth through aromatic deception and the girdling of the Earth with satellites. And this guy with the Tesla car, that Musk, whatever his name is, Eli, whatever his name is, doesn't matter. His name isn't Buddha. That's the problem with him. His name isn't Rudolph.
Yeah.
The red-nosed reindeer. It should be. That's what he should name himself. But he is starting a new project where he's putting like 1 million satellites or something. I mean, the exact number's out there to get. But he's going to completely put so many satellites that people are wondering if we're going to be able to see the stars anymore. And they don't understand the electronic girdling that is going to make our inner guts gurgle. I don't think we spiritually understand how we need to have a breath, a subtle breath with stars and changing stellar influences, ever-changing stellar influences and rhythms. So we're being cut off from the spiritual worlds as well as seeing the light. I mean, some people are trying to protect the dark night. We need to protect the dark sacredness within each other's. We need to guard in each other's solitude, like Rilke says. Another thing to really look at very seriously and ponder, Saturn-Pluto cycles of conjunctions are 33 to 38 years.
When was the last time? Do you know?
Yeah, it's in just, it was 30-some years ago, I think. But it's in here somewhere. That wasn't as important to me right now as like the last time that Saturn and Pluto was in Capricorn. See, that is more mysterious. So the thing I want to point out right now is the average age of the United States citizen is 39.4 for the female and 36.8 for men. So in other words, the average age of Americans is the cycle of Saturn-Pluto.
Yeah.
And people are going through a midlife crisis of poverty consciousness versus incredible egotism that they're going to be the richest person in the world and win the lottery, and they're going to be a Hollywood rap star, movie star, and they're going to be president. And I don't want to get lost in the psychology of this, but I think it gives you plenty of that idea of the 33 to 38 year cycle, in that the average age of men and women are that age. And we're moving toward the average age of being 42, which is freedom. I mean, I think we are moving toward the Uranus opposing Uranus at 42. Right now, we're in this crisis of Saturn's return and the midlife crisis, and you haven't, like 42 years old is when Carl Jung said the inner externalizes to the outside and the outside internalizes to the inside, and people go through this kind of rebirth of they're twice 21, but now they have brains. And so a lot of people have affairs around 42. I mean, there's certain times where you have affairs at 21, and challenge to the marriage, and 28 maybe, but the Saturn return, and then you get to that funny place from Saturn return to 33, 35 is a pretty strong change, and then when you get to 42, and then you jump to 52, usually more wisdom comes about, but then 60, 63 is another critical time. So I'm just pointing out that there's something to do with this age, the Saturn-Pluto. We're older now, becoming authorities, or we hate authorities because we're not successful enough, and it's structure and law versus youthfulness and teenage stuff. I mean, because Pluto's associated a lot with puberty rights, too, and pissed off teenagers, and woundology, psychology, and I'm never going to get over it, and I'm going to get even, stuff like that. So we got a lot of people in the world wanting to get even. If we want to talk to somebody who wants to get even, we could talk about the Saturn-Pluto that was so present during the Opium Wars. Britain wanted the goods that China had, and they were running out of silver. And they were going all around the country trying to get the silver. And they couldn't get enough silver, so what they did is they bought opium from Turkey, later India. The United States would get it from India. And they would give opium away until you're addicted, and then they'd sell it to all the Chinese. So they would get, all of China was so opiated and drugged out that they'd lost like something like a third of the, Saturn Pluto was part of the British East India Trading Company silver for tea. They wanted tea and all the expensive goods that China had to offer at cheap labor. And they couldn't get enough silver, so they gave them drugs. And they sold them drugs in trade. And it got so bad that China was so overtaken that the Emperor of China made a law that you couldn't take drugs or they would kill you. Forget British and America looking the other way and sneaking in goods and bringing in opium from India. The Emperor of China said, if you take drugs, we're going to kill you before the opium or the British kill you. So the British started a war. They wanted to force China. It led right into the Opium Wars, where British forced China to let in two things: opium and Christianity. And so, because they knew that would like get them on board, and they would take indentured servants to the USA. So the British were selling indentured servants Chinese to America. And in 1842, the Treaty of Nanking, which wasn't really a treaty because the British just told China what they were going to do, or they were going to keep killing everybody. Hong Kong ceded to, and they were forced and told what to do, to give Hong Kong to the British. That's how it happened. And Saturn was squaring Pluto. Saturn was conjunctive. The war went on for a long time, so the Saturn-Pluto thing played in at very critical moments. It took till 1949, from the 1800s. It took to 1949 when Mao came in to make China one country, and they made their own opium rather than buying it for pain. See, China had opium, but they were using it as medicinal, and they had control, and people weren't misusing it. And so the British taught them how to get high on it, addicted. Everybody kind of agrees with what I'm saying, I believe. Please correct me if you know different. In 1820, China totally addicted to opium from the British from India. Neptune was squaring the Saturn-Pluto conjunct. The Opium Wars started in 1939. When China wanted to stop this from happening, British just started a war. China war on drugs started in 1839 with Saturn square Pluto and ended in 1860. Neptune was discovered during the Opium Wars. Neptune's associated with drugs. Now, the Neptune's either you're numbed out, or you're escaping, or you're transcendental spiritual. Neptune can be the most spiritual. I have strong Neptune aspects, so does Robert Hand, and so does every great astrologer, including Dane Mudger, I think, has a strong Neptune. And this can make you psychic, intuitive, and at one-ment, but it can also make you fall into atonement. China started destroying opium from 1850 to 1864 after 20 million lives were lost to it from the British invasion and through the opium. 20 million lives. U.S. brought opium from Turkey and India to China. 2. Opiates. Opiates are now a big problem in America. That's what's playing into the Saturn-Pluto thing. When Saturn-Pluto conjuncts in January, I'm hoping that something will really, truly happen. Just like the Emperor said, there's no more. So we're hoping that they're going to control it, or it's going to control us. And opiates are a huge problem now. People taking bad heroin, drugs. Drugs are being legalized. And a lot of it's for the good. We don't have time to go into it, but a lot of it's medicinal. It takes away aches and pains. It gives people a fresh brain if they're stuck. Some people are just doping up with it. And they're not using it to get smarter like some people I know. Opiates now a big problem. My understanding that most of them are made in China. My friend Brian Lynch told me a long time ago that China's never going to forgive us for the Opium Wars and ransacking the Summer Palace and raping the emperor's wife or niece or some crazy thing. I think that's true, but if it's not, there's 5,000 other things that are true that are just as bad. In 1851, the Saturn-Pluto aspect, slave labor in the U.S. agriculture started to become very, very strong. As Abraham Lincoln and Ben Franklin warned us, voluntary economic servitude is the problem now we face with the Saturn-Pluto. I don't think we can just give money away, but we can educate from the bottom up. Like Rudolf Steiner trying the bottom up with agriculture and biodynamics, Waldorf school, forms of art, using your hands and feet, working with other people, working to make money, working to make honey. 1883 Saturn-Pluto was part of Edison and Tesla's chart. A grounding of spiritual forces. The Saturn-Pluto can be a grounding of spiritual forces or an over-concretization, materialism of those spiritual forces that kill freedom and true love. In the 1870s, the buffalo and wolves were slaughtered by USA soldiers. So the British smuggling opium into China. So I wanted to say that. Does anybody want to add any ideas or questions or anything about what I just said?
What's the sign that it's happening in, Robert?
The sign that it's happening now is Capricorn.
What degree?
Let me see. What degree is it? I have that here somewhere. Before we get that, I want to add, besides Saturn, Pluto being associated with like oil, Saudi Arabia, and all the countries that have resources that we want, and this perpetual war that keeps resources under control of certain powers. But also the Saturn-Pluto was around when World War II ended. See, it can end things, but it can also begin things. When it ended, the world was restructured in the sense of for moneymakers and corporations. And it's also a time where the International Monetary Fund started. So the Saturn-Pluto is associated with the beginnings of a base for an international currency system, which will come about in the following 2 to 3 years. And a universal money or a handling of currency, whether it's with actual money, which will probably be around because people love to touch things. But the money will kind of be disappear into like by just your energetic field, or they've gone beyond looking at your eyes. They've got it into the electromagnetic fields and the way you move and breathe. Just by the way you move through a room, if they can't see your face, they can kind of, it's getting that like that. And the 1982 Saturn-Pluto, which was the last one, was the Hawaii volcano, economic recession, and Michael Jackson's Thriller album was out. So it's associated with, I have a theory that if you really do your homework, you'll see a certain aspect like Saturn-Pluto. And every other time, like there'll be a Saturn aspect, then there'll be another Saturn-Pluto, then there'll be the next time. So it's every other time it's a positive, and every other time between it's a negative. It's a theory, or we could say a masculine, feminine type energy, or electromagnetic, or an internalizing versus externalizing. And so that's why a lot of astrologers get a little, unless you can discern that, they want the same thing to happen every time. So, but I have to say that there is an increase, I'm expecting an increase in volcanic activity, and we are getting very close to an economic recession, and kind of everybody knows there could be a temporary big drop in the market, if not economic recession. And so what I'm predicting is that one of those possibilities is the end of November, because, and I'm predicting it through the United States chart and the President Trump's chart, that the markets could fall very drastically. Now, how long is a little bit more of a question. I mean, when you're walking into the Saturn Pluto in January, is it only that long? Or is it that the Saturn Pluto makes it last a lot longer? Because Saturn Pluto is a pretty long aspect. Like, you know, you can divide 35 into 2, and you get like 18 or 16 or just post puberty or something, or you get half that. You can divide it into 9 years old, something like that. You could do that too. There's cycles within cycles and the bigger arcs, and so you have your question, 1982. In 1931, the Saturn opposition Pluto was when the Depression, which started in 1929, but by 31 it was really going strong. Also, you see the Saturn opposition Pluto during the Vietnam War peak. So I've noticed in the past when I used to, Doug here used to see me make predictions for the papers, and I would predict whenever Israel would have like more of a war inflamed with other countries around, and there was always these Saturn Pluto things, territorial rights and taking other people's land and returning it later with some other deal, making. Another thing that I want to make you understand is that there's a couple aspects that are happening that are huge, and Saturn Pluto is one of them. So we're moving toward a time, excuse me, we're moving toward a time where in musical chairs, everybody gets to play around. Like the president, whether you like the president or not, he's doing a lot of playing around, checking things out, backing off, coming back forward. Everybody is. All the presidential contenders are. They're checking stuff out, they're falling back, what works, what doesn't work. When Saturn hits Pluto in January, everyone's going to want to take a stand. Now, if we're wise, we'll take a polite wisdom stand out of loving kindness to each other's positions. Like, for instance, Doug and I are the best of friends, and we debate fiercely as anybody would debate, but we always love each other underneath it all. And we have a bunch of friends like this. And so even if we disagree and we're mad at each other, angry, or whatever those words are, we still have this deeper thing that this is way heavier than us, what we're all involved with. And we have to handle each other very carefully. And it's hard to do. And so I think the Saturn-Pluto thing is where some people are going to go as far as they can and it's over. If you hang on to things that are over and you don't complete them, or have loving kindness, selflessness with Pluto, and tremendous patience through time with Saturn, and Saturn is that either you're the doctor or you're the patient, and Pluto's either you're the jailer or the prisoner, right? And you throw in Neptune, and then you're in an insane asylum, or you're part of the caretaking, psychology, drug department in the insane asylum. All the drug guys are, they can be medicine for sure, but a lot of times it's like the insane asylum. Now it's also the #1 place to do art. So the Saturn-Pluto, to be precise, the Saturn-Pluto is the end of the road that the traveling Wilburys talked about. So a lot of people are going to die, retire, step back. There are going to be some people that finally step forward with a little gem that really, something they do or write or say, or there's going to be a lot of gems that go down in history. But those are the exceptions. The masses are tremendously hit. There could be a devastating now I'm saying this for a lot of reasons we don't have time to go into, but let's say one of the reasons is there's a whole bunch of planets that are really close together. Michelson has a yellow book. Neil Michelson was a good friend of mine way back. He has a yellow book on the phenomena of the cyclic planets, and he makes point of like when the planets are bunched up together. And so when you can look at this chart right here for the winter solstice, and you can see how you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 planets are all together. Then you have Neptune and Uranus on the right, upper right. We don't count the node up there, but we could. But basically, you're looking at the winter solstice as a sign for the new year. And you have all these planets bunched up. Now, in the course of the day, the sun will continue to move slowly, but the ascending sign, all these planets, this is like midnight, it's close to midnight, 11 p.m. something. The planets are going to go this way all around. So in the course of a day, this whole chart would just turn in one day, and the moon would go up, 6 or 7 or 14 degrees or something. 14 degrees in a whole day, around 13, 14. The planets, imagine in one day the planets basically stay the same, but the whole wheel turns. But the planets relative to each other. It's all relative to each other that gives meaning to things. Otherwise, if I had universal love, we could make love or make a whole bunch of money. It's nothing personal, But so if we get too personal, it's not good because I'm going to screw the whole world because I'm just so crazy over something, money or you or something. So the planets are like that too. It's all relative. So you see, the interesting thing about this, but before we do this, before we go into this part, I want to separate. I'm going to jump into this next, but I want to separate you can see right here, the Saturn-Pluto is severity and cold and meanness, bottom line. Venus is trying to escape into Aquarius. There'll be a lot of love. There'll be people who just somehow love in a way that's remarkable and share because it stands out a little bit. And the fact that Jupiter is here gives us a little bit of faith that Jupiter and Venus are trying to smother the Saturn-Pluto. So the Venus and Jupiter can be, it's time for a new heroics about huge projects that benefit the world. So whether they're protecting, we're not able to protect the national forest. Can we create new cathedrals? There was a time where Saturn and Pluto were associated with, especially the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, that's going to happen. Now remember, Saturn-Pluto conjuncts in January. Jupiter conjuncts Saturn in December of 2020. And see, that's the huge one. Because the last time Jupiter and Saturn, it happens every 20 years, right? So we can go back to the year 2000. We can go back to the year 1980, when Reagan came into power after that. We can go back to 1960, the brink of the 1960s. We can go back to 1940, the 1920s, the Roaring '20s. You see how the Roaring '20s are real active? And the 60s got really crazy too as we kept going into them. 1980s, the whole Republican Party came in and wiped out the hippies, and Reagan came into power, and money and banks were bigger than things. Money was worth more than things. The inflation stopped of Carter in the 70s and came out of the 60s. So you see things go from kind of a left wing to a right wing, and they swing back and forth. And then you have 2020, we have the year 2000. And and then we have 2020. Now, it's every 20 years, but when you start to look at when was Jupiter-Saturn in Aquarius? This is going to happen in Aquarius, by the way. Saturn-Jupiter is going to happen in Aquarius. So the Saturn-Pluto is in Capricorn. Our Capricorns, most Capricorns, like, David Spangler was a Capricorn, but when Nixon was a Capricorn, every head of every country was Capricorn. The head of Russia, Politburo, the head of Russia, the head of Spain, Mexico. During Nixon's time, everybody was a Capricorn. David Spangler and some of the most spiritual people I know are also Capricorns. Ray Merriam is a Capricorn. I'm a Capricorn. So some people really, you go to extremes. Capricorn's ruled by Saturn, and they're really intense and extreme. And Pluto wants to go to the extreme till one of us dies. It doesn't matter which one. Those are really crazy people. And Saturn and Pluto's getting together. So we have Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn, but then we have Jupiter, Saturn in December in Aquarius, which is, not this coming December, December 2020. The last time it happened was in 1228 AD.
Wow. That's that long.
When it was in Aquarius. And what else happened then was Christian de Troyes wrote Parsifal, and it was very popular at this point. So in other words, I'm saying that the fact that Venus is in Aquarius, again, if we did this properly, we'd have a weekend to do it. We'd have a meditation at some point on Venus and Aquarius. We'd have a meditation to see if one of us could channel something more or come up with the intuition. But I'm saying that a couple things. Parsifal by Quentin de Troyes, the first Parsifal Grail book, which is kind of like an advanced book to the consciousness soul that Rudolf Steiner claimed was a new age of conscious soul in the early 1400s. Roughly 100 years after the Templars were murdered, and when Tsongkhapa somehow came about with the Yellow Hat Tibetan teachings. But this idea of the Jupiter, Saturn, Aquarius, it has a Parsifal theme, but it also has, there's a shadow and a good side. They were building the cathedrals, the great cathedrals. The Templars were building the cathedrals. And so I think that the Jupiter, Saturn, Aquarius had to do with this kind of idea of building a cathedral or a center for people to coagulate, a new form of town hall and sharing of ideas. And the cathedral back then, you could have a spiritual experience if you were learned or not, and you didn't even know how to read, with the ideas that were presented by other people there and the sermon in stone of the great cathedrals. The sermon in the stained glass window, the relationship of dark and light, the relationship of the geometrical structure and being in it, which is another talk. But I see the Jupiter in Aquarius as the return of the spiritual Templars in different places that you won't be able to recognize them, and doing work to help the earth at this time. And in 1128, exactly 100 years, 1128, by the way, the 100-year thing is a big deal with the Rosicrucians, that certain secrets would get revealed 100 years later. And so at 1128, the Templars return from Jerusalem, and 100 years later exactly is this Jupiter-Saturn and the release of Parsifal and the Sixth Crusade. And 3 years after that, the Inquisition begins, of the burning of witches and stealing of land if you're declared a witch. So, when you think in these terms, when you think that in 32 years, 33 years later, Chartres Cathedral is consecrated, which takes off in its 33rd year after the Jupiter-Saturn. There's a lot of cycles that work around this. And when you have a Jupiter-Saturn in Aquarius, it influences the whole time till there's another one. And then there's a half time. So I did a lot of research on like this kind of thing when you take the cycle of the Jupiter-Saturn Aquarius to the next Jupiter-Saturn now in 2020 from 1228, you can divide that into 4 or 2, and you get interesting timetables. But right for now, the main thing is to point out the Parsifal mystery, to point out that Tibetan Buddhism was happening behind the scenes with other notables. And most importantly, besides the Parsifal, in 1228, the African slave trade begins. So right at the time of Parsifal, slavery with the African slave trade and the issues around reparation and feeling enslaved to something, whether it's your addictions, desires, fears. People are addicted to things. And they feel like they're slaves, they're slaving for other people, and they're not. I think it's okay not to get paid enough. It's not okay not to be educated enough. That's a whole other thing. When you can be enlivened within with your relationship to the world around you and our connection to each other, past, present, and future, and the cosmology and anthroposophy of like the human consciousness and form and psyche throughout history, in the form, the consciousness, and destiny of the human being and what it means to be human. This is a whole enrichment program that we lack. And even though there's many of us, people in the room, that have an unbelievable understanding of it, none of us are quite able to heal the world. And so if you keep studying all these spiritual things, you start to feel wounded, like the Fisher King. You start to feel wounded because you're wounded by what's going on with the world, and you're wounded by the beatific vision that you see. There's one wound where you're actually hurt. There's a whole nother wound that's way worse, that creates gods and heroes and monsters, cosmic monsters, if you're not careful. And that is seeing what could be. So in 1228, the last Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius was the African trade slave beginning. But it's also another thing that I want to point out that I know a couple of my good friends here will really appreciate that I pointed this out, because it will give your imagination a very creative stir. And you'll start to imagine like what the possibilities could be that are coming up by December of 2020. You can even feel the energy in the room starting to stir by the fact that I haven't even said this yet, but because all of us in this room are psychic and spiritual, you can feel it coming, that there's something's going to happen. Something happened before that's going to recapitulate and could have great meaning for many of us. And here it is. At that same time in 1228, that we have this idea of behind-the-scenes Tibetan Buddhism. We have this 100 years before the consciousness soul, 200 years, 100 years, 200 years, actually 200 years. The conscious soul takes off. But it's every 100 years this funny thing happens. But we also have exact dating for Detroit, Parsifal, the African slave trade, but there was something else that happened that I want to make known. And that is the dancing plague in Strasbourg. It was called the dancing plague in Strasbourg. People just started dancing like crazy everywhere at all times of the night and day. And they called it a plague. They couldn't help these people. They couldn't stop them. They couldn't talk even. They just go, hey, what are you doing? Hey, and you just want to keep dancing. It was a dancing plague, and it was huge, and it was known all about the world. And it was starting to jump around the world. And so, I know, you might start to feel the itch here tonight. If you do, just stand up, dance a little bit, turn around, do the little wiggle. Sit down. I knew that was going to be one of the highlights of today. So we can take the Saturn-Pluto aspect, the Jupiter-Saturn aspect has, Jupiter's a 12-year cycle, Saturn's around 30, but when you think of 60-year cycles, you have the 5 times 12, putting the Saturn and the Pluto together, the Jupiter and Saturn. The Jupiter and Saturn together, Jupiter takes 12 and Saturn 30. So you have 2 Saturn cycles to make 60, and then you have 5 12-year cycles, that's it. So then we can go, you could have quite a journey going from 2020 back 60 years ago to 1960 again, and then the year 1900 and 1840, 1780, 1720, the whole thing, what went on with America during those times, 1240, 1300, some pretty critical times, 1180, 1120. It goes back into that Templar Grail making thing. And when you think of 1300, you're thinking right when the Templars were starting to get in trouble, before they could figure out, Philip the Fair could figure out in France how to manipulate the Pope enough, they would steal the money. Even though they knocked off the Templars, their whole navy disappeared. And it's a whole big story of where the Templars went. And, there's a materialistic story, but there's also a spiritual story, that there are spiritual impulses that reincarnate as kind of like an oversoul to spark. This Jupiter-Saturn, Steiner was born in 1861 at the start of the Civil War with the moon Jupiter-Saturn pretty close together in Virgo. So this Jupiter-Saturn can initiate huge things. Saturn-Pluto is where the worst things happen with weather and plutocrats and cryptomaniacs and corporatocracy and cryptocracy and plutocracy and plutonium and like that. But it can also be huge projects that benefit large amounts of people. It can also be seeds that influence. A lot of people do things that it takes 100 years or more to realize what a genius they were. So that it happens to a lot of people. It's amazing. People put out a lot of spiritual work, and later somebody just rediscovers it. So I wanted to mention Steiner's connection to Jupiter-Saturn, and in September of 1921, 3 months before the Goetheanum burned, Jupiter-Saturn, 27 Virgo. And it's my theory that whoever burnt the Goetheanum, that they attended the lectures, the couple lectures before the lecture that he gave on the 31st on New Year's Eve, and then the fire started. And I think that whoever was at the lecture the night before set the fire, and he didn't like whatever Steiner said. And so if you read these lectures beforehand, you can have a big insight into that, which I don't have time to go into my insights on it, but that was an inspiration whispered in my ear by some angel that I imagined I heard. Okay, so the first Goetheanum Hall was completed in 1919. The first Goetheanum had a Jupiter-Neptune conjunct with the big hall completion. And Jupiter-Neptune is like the number one aspect for like major, some of the better popes, for instance, and major spiritual people that influence masses in society, and they're almost otherworldly, will have their share of Jupiter-Neptune aspects. I want to read a poem, and then we'll go to a chart on the board, which will be more fun. By Rilke. Poem is called, or this statement, poem or statement. grazing lunar occultation, Dornicht. I don't know if it's Dornicht or it's pronounced Dornicht. Is that another place nearby, or is there another name for Dornicht? Donicht, grazing lunar occultation. We are continually overflowing toward those who preceded us, toward our origin, and toward those who seemingly come after us. We are continually overflowing toward those who preceded us, toward our origin, and toward those who seemingly come after us. And it is our task to imprint this temporary, perishable earth into ourselves so deeply, so painfully and passionately, that its essence can rise again invisibly inside us. We are the bees, we are the honeybees of the invisible. We wildly collect the honey of the visible to store it in the great golden hive of the invisible. So this first part, to sum up what I'm saying, Saturn, everything, a lot of people have good aspects right now, but they're not playing out the way they normally would, because Saturn and Pluto, wherever you have it in your chart, like if you look at your ascending sign, like what's your, what house is it in? Just generally speaking.
My ascending sign?
What house is Capricorn in your chart?
It's my
Does anybody know?
First house.
First house. So Saturn Pluto means that you're going to totally focus a crystal. Saturn Pluto's like, it's crystals. It's like, it's the origin of the ego and somewhere in Atlantis. It's like a total crystallization of your personality, make it or break it. Now, because Saturn Pluto is a careful craftsman, it's like Saturn Pluto, Saturn's going to have everything. No, we have to have everything right. So you got to be careful being too hard on yourself or others when you do this. But if it's in your first house, so you'll feel like you're getting hit by everything. Meteors are falling on you. But you're going, no, we're almost done. This is almost done. This is going to be the one, or something like that. So it gives you a tremendous focus. So you have to have a tremendous amount of compassion to antidote. Patience, Saturn, compassion, Pluto. Because in my book, I nail it in my book. It's the most crass plutonian vastness of the evil wealth of the gnomes, the dark gnomes. But on the positive side, it's this tremendous sacrifice for this thing that's going to help everybody. It's either a seed or a finalizing completion of project or some phase of your life, And of course, with Saturn Pluto, you can't help it. Every once in a while you go, I really should retire at some point. And so you think that at some point, no matter how old you are. So what's your ascending sign?
Oh, my ascending sign is Virgo.
Virgo. So if it's Virgo, so then you have Capricorn in the fourth house or something?
Yeah, Capricorn's fourth house.
So the fourth house, and this is not even looking at your other planets. This is just looking at the house. So the fourth house, if it's in the fourth house, it would be way down deep inside of you. Or is it your home? Because the idea is that it's way down deep inside of you. You're laying a base of some sort, and everything's melting into this rock-solid double dodecahedron, which, by the way, in my new book on tarot is going to have this huge thing about the secret. One of the secrets is a double dodecahedron related to the Kabbalah and the tarot cards, the major arcana. So, but you're laying the foundation, see? And so that you start to think, like, is it going to kill me? What's your bottom line? What's under your feet? That whole kind of thing is like some kind of huge, either accepting. Again, the Saturn Pluto is a major forgiveness, acceptance speech, or death. Or is it, it's like kind of like feeling like some part of you has to die, and you should midwife that, I forget now if it's 10 or 15 or 20% of every forest has to die and disintegrate into the rest of the forest to keep the rest of the forest healthy. But in the past, like in the 80s and 90s, the way that they always trick everybody is they go, well, this forest's dead, we'll just take it out. So they take it out, so then another 10 or 20% of the forest has to die to feed it, see? So we need, as human beings, to have like a third of our life, a third of our years should be composted, or something like that. Or is it that we're saving a third of ourselves and composting 2/3? I mean, it depends on how initiated you are, or if you're just enlightened, or if you're just an idiot. If you're an idiot, 10 or 15% of your life should be composted every year to nourish the other 85%. But what we have is we have 3% or 10 or 15% get all the money, and they're supposed to help the other 85%. It just isn't working. I don't think we should look for the trickle-down effect. I think we should be looking for the tickle-down effect. That we're tickled, our fancy is tickled, we're enthusiastic to work for free, it's so cool. Or we need an education. How many people were paid to build the Goetheanum? How many people were paid to go on the Crusades? How many people were paid to fight the Crusades? How many people were built the cathedrals? It was something that you have to get people to help you do. And if you're doing it all by yourself, yeah, you're going to be sacrificed. I know. I'm always doing it myself and feeling a little sacrificed. So you want to pitch in and sacrifice yourself before other people do it.
That's right.
There is one temple in the universe, and it is the body of man, Novalis. And I say there is one altar. I say there's one altar in the universe, and it is the heart of each and every human being, the soul of angels are the virtues that we can create and co-create. The Spirit of God is art and song. So make your life into a piece of art and sing. So that is I'm saying that we're going to go through this kind of crucifixion or rooting. Like Saturn Pluto works really good when you're rooting and behind the scenes, you're always working on yourself and cleaning and throwing things out you don't need, and you're not taking things, you're not overburdened by things that are killing you. You can look at your life and see what are you doing that's killing you, and who drains you when you see them, and who wakes you up and makes you feel more alive. And that's worth gambling on, I think. And so then we go from Saturn Pluto, where we're off face with what doesn't work, and maybe a major catastrophe, by the way, or 3. And there's a huge amount of bad aspects that take place, later in the year, like you'll see on the handout I gave. And people who buy this talk I'll send you the handout if you want. But when you look at Mars square Neptune in January 28th, there's a real setup of being too toxic and overfed and too much weird fantasy. And the Sun Neptune March 8th, conjunct in Pisces. Are your dreams and spiritual visions going to help you, or are they sinking you? And then we have the February 16th to March 9th Mercury retrograde going into, there's still a lot of good aspects, but then we go March 23rd, mark my words, Mark has the word Mars in it. March 23rd, Mars conjunct Pluto, very violent aspect. Police state or need for police, a need for a state of calm. As Taylor Swift, my new love of my life lately, just partially. She said, everybody calm down. She's got a song about something like that, calming down, And if you take a look at her, she's getting people to vote, and she's a smart cookie that doesn't crumble. I think the Jupiter-Saturn is the cookie that doesn't crumble, which is coming up. But the Mars-Pluto, March 23rd, March 31st, Mars conjunct Saturn at 0 Aquarius, trying to kill the new age or trying to work for it. So that's a rough time into March. And you go into the Jupiter conjunct Pluto, April 4th, happens 3 times in a year. That's a giant death and rebirth of social identity. There's going to be a major shift in how we relate to culture and art and music and what kind of movies. And the Saturn-Pluto is tremendously violent, where you're just numb. After you watch these violent Hollywood movies, you're numb to seeing violence on TV and your friends and neighbors. You get numb. Or you start to throw yourself into the violence. And so the Jupiter-Pluto is like the Templar, the spiritual Templar, who's fighting for what's good, true, and beautiful, and how we can police ourselves so we don't need to have police us. And the Mars conjunct Saturn, March 31st, is a report card of how we're doing. And you can read the newspapers. And Mars square Uranus April 4th, a very dangerous aspect for accidents. The Jupiter-Pluto I mentioned is a new leadership and new people. Some people fall and other people rise. Some things are inflated, other things are deflated. There's a heavy separation between the good and bad, so-called, what's right and wrong and good and bad for us. It's a social identity crisis where we need social psychologists that heard the Disneyland, dizzying Disneyland of entertainment to get in and get out without hurting themselves. But we suffer from not being able to entertain ourselves by playing music and having spiritual storytelling and invoking in each other higher values and virtues, like in The Voice of the Silence or in Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, which are required reading to understand anything I'm saying. And so then we go to Saturn retrograde, another report card and a step back. Look at the retrograde period. May, Saturn, Venus, and Jupiter retrograde. May is a sense of going backwards. Mercury retrogrades in June. Mars conjuncts Neptune in June. So May and June are places where everybody gets confused and has to go backward and go, wait a minute, what is going on? And even August, Mars squares Pluto. Major shoot 'em up, violence, mean. Mars should be the Michaelic urge to redeem Hermes and Athena, redeeming Persephone. That's a longer rap. I go into it in my new book. But the summer looks rough. If you're traveling around those dates, you don't want to plan parties. I mean, you might get away with certain Neptune aspects, but Mars, Neptune, everybody gets too drunk and they throw up, or they bang their car on the way home, or they say bad things and we hate them, stuff like that. Mercury, I'm talking a little fast, and so forgive me if I'm saying it too roughly. We're coming from Detroit live. So we also look at Mars going retrograde, where September 9th through November 13th, during the election, during the election, Mars goes retrograde. And that is a rough one for economics. That's another time period that could be a little rough for a presidential election. And that Mars retrograde and that will be squaring Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto. I have a lot more to say that in my next lecture, which is going to be in November. The election stress, weird weather, anger, aggression. Mars is guns, thrust booster rockets for some. And Mercury goes retrograde October 13th to November 13th, right leading up to the election. So this is going to be a very peculiar election. I'm still looking for somebody new to run, but at the point I'm predicting that Trump will lose to Elizabeth Warren, not Harris. Who knows what she'll be doing? She might be part of it. I don't know. It might have been a Freudian leak, a Frodo leak. But Marianne Williamson would be in the game. Oprah has lots of good aspects during the election. Trump has aspects that make me think that he thought he was going to win. Just like he thought he was going to lose, he won. He's going to think he's going to win, he's going to lose. He's going to make a big fuss for a few weeks, maybe a month, big fuss, that he was cheated, and he's going to blame people. Now, again, anything can happen. As pointed out before, I've been very accurate with predictions, but there was one time I was wrong. And I don't know if it's you miss things or you're just not in tune right. Astrology is a great science. It's just a question if you're always tuned. And I did give up coffee to be a little more tuned. I've been off coffee. You'll be glad to know for 104 days, 3 hours, 7 minutes, and 36 seconds. I don't miss it. No, I don't miss it. Damn it, I don't miss it. Oh, never mind. I'm shaking. I miss it. No, I do. I love coffee. It just didn't love me. Okay, green tea. So from a quote by Thibodeau, I love quoting that guy. He's a friend of mine, very close friend. Power works by subtraction, love by addition and multiplication. It only adds up. Hey, kids. Let's repeat it. Power works by subtraction. Power corrupts absolutely. And love by addition and multiplication. It only adds up. So that's what I wanted to say Bless your heart, MayflowerBookshop.com. I'm on YouTube with songs and talks. Tune me in. Remember, at YouTube, you can turn me off whenever you like, which you can do when you buy this tape. Bless your hearts.